Check 1, 2. 20 seconds, that's quite a delay.
Nā koutou katoa. Kia ora rā, kia ora rā. I runga i ngā kōreroa kui mā koroma, ka tākina tētahi karakia, kia whakatū whera tēnei kaupapa i tēnei pō. E rongo, ko te rongo a whare, ko te rongo a marae, ko te rongo a te hā, ko te rongo maiwhiti, kia hau mai, ko te rongo mau, e rongo whakairi ake ki runga kia tīna, haumi e hui e, tāe ki e.
Hoi nora, kia ora tātou. Hoi nau mai, piki mai, hara mai i rungi te kaupapa nei, me ki te tuku kōrero, te tuku kahau nei, o Michael Vokeling, Ruth. Hara mai koutou i rungi i tērā kōrero. Nau mai hoki mai koutou, ki rungi te marae o rongo marairoa, anō rā, tō tātou whare nei a Hawane, te hono a Hawaiki. Nō reira, kei ngā rangatira, kei ngā hau e whā matā waka tangata, nau mai, piki mai, hara mai. Hara mai i rungi te kaupapa kia rongo nei, kia āwhina, me ona whiako, me ona pukinga, nō reira hariko ana te ngākau. Nō reira te rape hui ngā tangata ka hoki ngā mahara, nō reira ka tuku te mai aroha ki te hunga ko whetūrangi hea. Rātou, ko rātou, nā rātou, tātou nei, i te rānei. Nō reira ko tēnei te pō, nau mai te ao. Nō reira he mihi anō nei ki te mana whenua Ngāti tō rangatira, te ati awa taranaki whānui, pō te ao, au te pō, he mihi ake. He mihi ake ki ngā maunga whakahi me taua tāne nei e Pākia mai rā. Nō reira, nau mai, piki mai, hara mai. Kia ora tātou. Look, I'm just going to welcome everyone to this Michael Vokeling Memorial Lecture. Welcome you here today. This is the 7th Memorial Lecture. Ruth, it's good to have you here. For those that don't know the late Michael Vokeling, he was a true advocate of arts, culture and heritage. Michael became the youngest person to be appointed as the director of the Queen Elizabeth II Arts Council, now Creative New Zealand, and after 11 years as the head of the Arts Council, he moved onto his role as the executive director of the National Museum and National Art Gallery. Between 1988 and 1993, he played a key role in the development of Te Papa after overseeing the amalgamation of the National Museum and the National Art Gallery and the framing of the legislation for the Museum of New Zealand in 1992. Both Awhina and I were there at the latter part when Michael was at the helm, and I can say he was a great person, a great leader, and we still miss him today. He then went on to establish and teach in the Museum and Heritage Studies program at Te Herenga Waka, Victoria University, and this long association with museums and academia continued for the rest of his career, and he trained many of the new generation of museum professionals. He spent his last 20 years in tertiary education in areas of management, teaching, research, while maintaining connections with museums. And he had roles with the Welltech and many of the institutions in Australia. Michael was a passionate advocate for the cultural life of New Zealand. Through the annual Michael Vokeling Lecture and the connection between Te Herenga Waka, Victoria University and Te Papa, this lecture series is a partnership between National Services Te Paurangi and the Museum and Heritage Studies program as an acknowledgement of the lasting connection first forged by Michael Vokeling and therefore in his memory. But before introducing Dr. Conal McCarthy, I just want to acknowledge kia koe Awhina, Dr. Awhina, Tākuta Awhina Tamarapa, our former curator at Te Papa. We still miss you a lot. Awhina karanga taonga, karanga tangata, karanga whenua is very much needed in all of our museum institutions and galleries. The recovery and reclamation of our Indigenous practice and knowledge is something that museums must do to emancipate themselves from their colonial and Western practices and make them more connected, more relevant, more meaningful, and of more value to our people and culture now and into the future. Awhina tēnā koe hoki ora mai ki tō whare nei a te papa. So without any further ado, I'm going to just introduce you to the Professor Conal McCarthy. Professor McCarthy holds the position of Professor of Museum and Heritage Studies at Te Herenga Waka, Victoria University. That's an interdisciplinary humanities scholar whose work bridges history, theory and practice within public culture. While his primary discipline is museum and heritage studies, his research draws on and contributes to related fields including sociology, anthropology, history and art history. His academic interests encompass museum history, professional practice, Māori visual culture and contemporary heritage issues. And as we know, he's published extensively on the history of Te Papa and extending his research into transnational comparative framework that examines how Indigenous communities worldwide interact with cultural heritage, public history, museums and galleries. And can I just say both Conal and Awhina are both former kaimahi of Te Papa. Hoi nora, mai te ngākau, can I just call on now for Professor Conal McCarthy. Kia ora tātou.
Tēnā koutou hara mai nei I tēnei pō, e whakarongo mai nei I te ipurangi. Kānau ngā mihi kia koutou I hara mai nei. He mihi tēnei ki te whānau o hongoika hara mai nei ki te tautoko I tō hoa a Awhina. Nō reira kānau ngā mihi kia koutou. Thank you, Arapata, for that introduction. Thank you to Victoria International Services and Te Papa for hosting yet another Michael Volkeling Memorial Lecture, and great to have Ruth here tonight as well. It's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Awhina Tamarapa. And those of you who know Awhina know that she is a very modest person. Ka re te kumere e kōrero mō tāna ake reka. Hoi anō, mā koe mea. So I'm going to give a little introduction to those of you that don't know Awhina so well just before she comes up and addresses you. So Awhina will talk a little bit about her background, but I can tell you that she has degrees from Auckland University, Massey University and Te Whare Wānanga o Raukawa, plus a PhD from Museum and Heritage Studies at Victoria University, Te Herenga Waka. And since working here at Te Papa as a curator, finishing her PhD, she's been a post-doctoral fellow in the Stout Research Centre at Victoria. And the project that she's doing for her postdoc, she'll be talking to you about tonight. Plus, as well as this postdoc, she has been involved with 2 international research projects funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council of the UK, the AHRC. The first from the AHRC with Bryony Onkiel from the University of Exeter, which is just completed, and the second is now underway with a future leadership fellowship which she's working on, and she'll be referring to these research projects as well as other work that she's doing. She's also just completed a handbook for Palgrave in the UK as a co-editor of a book called Tangata Whenua, Tangata Tiriti, Intercultural Heritage in Aotearoa, New Zealand. So with all of this work, I think that Awhina is going to be giving you a little smorgasbord of the various things she's involved in under the rubric of karanga taonga, karanga tangata, karanga whenua, reversing cultural amnesia, activating Māori practice in museums. Please welcome Awhina Tamarapa.
Tēnā korua e oku rangatira, Arapata Conal. E ngā reo, e ngā mana, e ngā karangaranga maha, huri noa I te motu, tēnā koutou katoa. E mihi kauana ki ngā iwi mana whenua, tarana ki whānui ki te upoko o tika. Tiatiawa Ngāti tō rangatira, e ngā whānau o hongoeka, takupuahia, ko taimai nei ki te tautoko, tēnā koutou. Tēnā koutou e te iwi kainga o te Papa Tongarewa, Arapata Courtney, ngā pautikanga, ngā whetū ririki, tēnā koutou. E ngā kaiwhaturaranga o Ngāti Raukawa, Tiatiawa, Ngāti Tōrangatira, ngā ringa toi o te motu, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. My acknowledgements to you, Ruth. Thank you to the Stout Research Centre for your support, Director Brigitte Bonish-Brednik, Emeritus Professor Richard Hill, Debbie, Museum and Heritage Studies Program Professor Conor McCarthy, Associate Professor Lee Davidson, students past and present, family, friends, everyone here. Ngā mihi nui kia koutou katoa. Thank you, especially to Victoria and Connell, for this honour and your support over the years. My recollections of Michael Volkeling was that he was a very warm and approachable person and supportive of Māori. I recall how happy he was at the opening of Kahungunu Ka Moe Ka Puta in the year 2000. This was a major exhibition of portraits of Ngāti Kahungunu ancestors taken by 19th century photographer Samuel Carnell. It was a big deal between the iwi and different institutions. In conversation with Michael, I naively said, wow, wouldn't it be great to celebrate iwi taonga like this all of the time? And he said enthusiastically, of course, why not? This koho, this talk, is a reminder of the magic that is possible when we think broadly and bravely about doing what's right. The title, Reversing Cultural Amnesia, Activating Māori Practice in Museums, aims to be provocative and states up front that many museums that collect cultural material tend to be burdened by a type of forgetfulness, leading to inertia. Okay, I can see some of you shifting uncomfortably in your seats. Some of you are squinting at me. Don't know about that. Not our museum. I may make points that you may not agree with, or describe situations that you haven't experienced. At the very least, I hope that this koho will provide some understanding of the idea that museums are fundamentally problematic spaces for Māori and Indigenous practitioners who are active in the transmission of cultural arts, customs, and knowledge. Firstly, what are taonga? Taonga are highly valued practices, knowledge, objects, places, resources, people, and information that link to ancestral history, customs, spiritual beliefs, and worldview. Taonga are tangible and intangible expressions of what is uniquely Māori, imbuing a sense of cultural identity and belonging. This is the opening of Hautiana Nui Wharenui Wauhiki Marae, 27th of June 2021. But back to cultural amnesia. The irony of museum preservation is that it constrains community values and fluidity necessary for cultural continuity, such as the maintenance of connection, relevance, and intergenerational meaning. Museum custodianship masks the damage of disconnection. The point is, these aren't new revelations. Cultural leaders working both inside and outside of museum institutions since their beginnings in Aotearoa, New Zealand in the 1850s, recognised a dilemma for Māori. According to scholars Conor McCarthy, Ngarino Ellis, Deirdre Brown and others, there has always been some form of agency by Māori to reclaim and shape the purpose of museums according to the time. According to the time, that is key. In our time now, one dilemma we face in museums today, I believe, amongst all the other challenges, is how to reverse cultural amnesia. How do we address sustained activation of cultural practice within museums? Not just a one-time invitation or event every now and then, but embedded, consistent, structural representation reflecting our country's founding living document, Te Tiriti o Waitangi. I'll pick up on those themes in my conclusions. For now, why is this subject important? If politics is power, academia is science, and arts is culture, what does that mean for us as a nation? For one thing, whether we like it or not, all of those elements shape museums. This is the Pitt Rivers Museum, Oxford, UK. Museums are microcosms, smaller versions of society. To Indigenous communities, they are sites of struggle and are contested knowledge spaces. George Horsecapture, Anandan First Nations curator, described his people's relationship with museums as being a strange and special link, and a love-hate relationship. The hate part being the barriers to access their cultural heritage. Keeping things in museums arguably preserves them, but at the cost of removal from those living contexts that give relevance and meaning. Why does this matter? Because without cultural practice, there is no continuity. Culture requires continuity, transmission between generations, and it has to be generous, inclusive, and free of gatekeeping. Otherwise, knowledge, customs, practices, and values are forgotten and become vulnerable to inertia, misinformation, and manipulation. The subject is something that I've been made aware of my entire work life, first at the National Museum, Buckle Street, and then Te Papa. So much so that I wanted to explore the topic in my master's studies, and I couldn't let it go. So through doctoral studies, another 5 years, I ended up getting to the heart of the matter, which revolves around power dynamics. The process of thinking through issues through a framework of kaupapa Māori, Māori-centred and Indigenous theories, was about incorporating our own ways of knowing and being to re-evaluate and reflect upon not only museums, but our roles as Māori in museums, and in my case, as a wahine Māori curator, mentored by practitioners, Pākehā and Māori, and the tensions there, including how easy it is to become complacent, to mirror the museum system by being essentially removed from community and from the fluidity of mātauranga Māori in practice by sitting at a desk, sitting in front of a keyboard, and sitting in a storeroom. Julian Mayrick, Professor of Creative Industries at Griffith University, Australia, was the 2022 Michael Vokeling Memorial Speaker. He spoke about cultural policy at a time of uncertain everything, which is now. In his conclusion, Mayrick talked about constitutional reform and having a just, ethics-based future. That's where I'll be heading to with this talk. He started with giving a personal story, as I've done, to position oneself within the frame of discussion. Now I'm going to continue to tell a series of stories involving cultural leaders, practitioners, and museum staff. In retelling those stories, I will discuss ideas around living taonga, restoration, cultural pedagogy, and liberation in a museum context. Let me start with a story about Māori weavers and museums. In the 1980s, two renowned Māori weavers, Digares Te Kanawa from Ngāti Maniapoto and Emily Schuster from Te Aroa, visited museums in the United Kingdom and the United States to view Māori weaving collections. These two distinguished weavers were pre-internet influencers, recording their experiences in the museum storerooms with a handheld video camera. Their experiences were profound in that they marveled over the skills and techniques employed by weavers of the past, materials and methods no longer used, complex designs and compositions that were free-flowing, a visual language of hidden meanings and symbols. Interviewed 20 years later, Digares spoke about how excited they were to be viewing and handling ancestral weaving far away from home. When they returned to their accommodation at night, they couldn't wait to try out the techniques they'd seen, sometimes waking up in the morning still holding their work. Emily, however, when interviewed in the 1990s, sadly recalled a visit that her and Digares made to the National Museum in Wellington in the late 1980s. It broke their hearts to see weaving stacked in boxes and shelves, piled high in a tiny room. This is a tāniko puoro and a kaitaka cloak in the British Museum. What these two beautiful weavers were doing was looking carefully at early techniques and recreating them. They were being inspired to bring back to life, to restore ancestral knowledge and practice. Digares later talked about how she would incorporate a lot of early patterns into her cloak weaving as living taonga, cultural practice continuing to thrive. This is a kahu wairoa decorated with dog tail tassels in the Pitt Rivers Museum. These master practitioners praised overseas museums for the way in which they provided unfettered access and took care of their collections. Even though much of those taonga were in storage, including rare examples no longer in Aotearoa and not known to the majority of people back home. How did it get like this? Māori material has been collected by Europeans since the first voyage of James Cook, Tahitian tohunga Tupaia, and entourage to Aotearoa in 1769. Today, ancestral heritage are held in museums throughout the world, often without connection to their origins or cultural context. This is the Colonial Museum, Museum Street, Thorndon, circa 1895 to 1910. Museums were developed in Aotearoa by Western scholarship and colonial enterprise. The Auckland Museum was founded in 1852, the Colonial Museum in 1865 in Wellington, the Otago Museum in 1868, and the Canterbury Museum in 1870 in Christchurch. Research societies of university-educated professional men set up the Auckland Institute, Wellington Philosophical Society, and the Otago Institute. Archaeology, ethnology, ethnography, and later anthropology were patriarchal Western systems which dominated the collecting and display practices of the colonial and later the Dominion Museum. Māori were native informants, giving over information extracted as part of fieldwork. Māori art and culture declined in the 19th and early 20th century as a result of colonisation. It was widely accepted at the time that Māori were a dying race and would be absorbed by a superior race. Museums at this time had a salvage mentality, collecting artefacts supposedly soon to disappear, despite the evidence that Māori were actively engaging with early museums to preserve items of cultural significance for the future. Politician and scholar Apirana Ngata made an impact in the museum world with fellow politician, anthropologist, medical doctor, museum director Te Rangihiro, otherwise known as Peter Buck, and Maui Pomare, politician and medical doctor. Ngata was passionate about new forms of Māori art, language and culture by reviving the old. His vision was for a bicultural generation able to hold themselves in two worlds, Western educated but guided by Māori values and principles. Ngata successfully oversaw the Māori Arts and Crafts Act in 1926. This important legislation was to preserve and maintain Māori arts. It was part of his overall mission for Māori economic and social independence. Ngata established the School of Māori Arts and Crafts in Rotorua in 1927. Experts in carving and tukutuku were employed to teach different tribal groups of men carving and teach women tukutuku. Carvings and museum collections were closely studied, inspiring new generations of artists. Tribes funded their students, materials, and eventual construction of fully decorated buildings. 42 meeting houses and halls were completed in association with Ngata, many still standing today. In 1947, Ngata gave an address to his peers in the Polynesian Society. He summarised his immense work by saying that his greatest desire has been to revive Māori culture as a living force within communities, not be relegated to dead exhibits in museums. Establishing the Māori Arts and Crafts movement, incorporating the learning within museums, was visionary. However, it was not supported well enough by the museum establishment to continue. Despite the efforts of Ngata establishing the School of Māori Arts in Rotorua, which eventually became the New Zealand Māori Arts and Crafts Institute today, weaving was steadily declining. In the 1950s, the newly formed Māori Women's Welfare League, Te Rōpū Māori Toko i Te Ora, recognised the serious risk to the arts of Te Wharepora a Hine Te Iwiiwa, the House of Weaving. Hine Te Iwiiwa being the female deity of weaving, childbirth and the lunar cycle. The Māori Women's Welfare League was a formidable movement. A founding member was Dame Rangimarie Hetit, a famed weaver of Ngāti Kinohaku, Ngāti Maniapoto. Rangimarie and later her daughter, Digares Te Kanua, began to teach customary weaving outside of their own tribe through the Māori Women's Welfare League. After the Second World War, unprecedented numbers of Māori moved from their rural communities to towns and cities for employment opportunities. The population went from 83% rural to 83% urban, believed to be the highest rate of urbanisation in the world. Government policies during the time of Ngata encouraged assimilation, which he and other parliamentarians and tribal leaders actively opposed. Ngata encouraged Māori independence. In the 1960s and 1970s, Māori and other Indigenous peoples were re-raising political governance and autonomy rights, loss of land and language. The epic Māori Land March in 1975, led by the matriarch Te Rarawa leader Whina Kupa, mobilised thousands by walking 1,500 kilometres from the north to Parliament grounds in Wellington. That year, the Waitangi Tribunal was established as a commission of inquiry to hear historic Māori grievances against the Crown's Treaty of Waitangi breaches. Young urban Māori were challenging racism and advocating for Māori rights, forming groups such as Ngā Tamatoa and the Te Reo Māori Society. Also in 1975, Whakatupuranga Ruamano Generation 2000 was conceived, a 25-year strategy to prepare the Confederation of Ngāti Raukawa, Te Atiawa and Ngāti Tōrangatira tribes for the 21st century, revitalising the taonga of Te Reo Māori, marae as our principal homes, people as our wealth, and tino rangatiratanga, the right to govern ourselves as the main objectives. Initiatives such as the 1977 Tū Tangata Stand Tall development program, led by Karapuke Tapu, Secretary of Māori Affairs, were centred on community-led developments to promote social and economic advancement through self-reliance. His sister was the well-known master weaver Eronoa Poketapu Hetit, based at their community of Waifetu, Lower Hutt, Wellington. As a close community, Waifetu was at the forefront of Māori cultural arts development, with Eronoa and her husband, Master Kawa Rangihetit, from Ngāti Tūwharetoa, Ngāti Maniapoto, and grandson of Rangi Mārie Hetit. Excuse me, I'm just going to have a drink of water. In the 1980s, the Te Māori Māori Art from New Zealand Collections exhibition became a unique flagship for Māori pride and cultural identity, raising public awareness and shifting complacency in New Zealand museums. 174 ancestral taonga were selected from 13 New Zealand museums. Te Māori opened in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, New York, on 10th of September 1984, travelled to St. Louis Art Museum, Missouri, and the M.H.D. Young Memorial Museum, San Francisco, with an extended tour to the Field Museum, Chicago, until July 1986. The next month, Te Māori returned to Aotearoa as Te Hukinga Mai, to the National Museum, Wellington, Otago Museum, Christchurch Art Gallery, then finally Auckland City Art Gallery in 1987. The exhibition was important in redefining taonga from specimens and ethnographic objects to art. Hirini Mokomead of Ngāti Awa, leading Māori arts and culture academic, was the principal advocate, debating for taonga to be seen as art rather than artefacts. The term taonga began to be used. A Māori subcommittee consisted of prominent people involved with Māori arts and culture, included Te Arawa Elder Kuru Waka, Karapuke Tapu, Tāmati Riri, Ngāti Porou, Piri Shasha, Ngāti Kaungunu, and Maina Mackenzie, Ngāti Hauiti, first Māori museum director in Aotearoa and the only woman on the committee. Matua Hirini wrote about Te Māori as the beginning of a new era of teaching young Māori about their heritage. He argued that taonga are not relics from the past, but occupy and are with us in the present, as Māori art brought out from the closet, from obscurity, and out of the cupboard of primitive contextualisation. Despite the international accolades, media attention, and triumphant return tour of New Zealand venues, Te Māori had shortfalls. Critics noted the selection of taonga was limited to sculptural forms dated to pre-1860 as a result of New York Metropolitan of Art curator Douglas Newton's influence. The exclusion of woven textiles alienated weavers and dismissed the arts of te wharepora altogether. Contemporary Māori art was not included, denying any reference to living practice, innovation, or artistic commentary. Along with the huge government investment, Mobil Oil Company was a major sponsor. This was controversial, given that Mobil was responsible for major environmental pollution of kaimoana beds by their synthetic fuel plant at Motunui, Taranaki. Taranaki Kuia Matarena Marjorie Cooper spoke out against Mobil's sponsorship. Even though weaving was omitted from the Te Māori exhibition, weavers were undeterred. The National Māori and Pacifica Weavers Collective, known then as Aotearoa Māori Moana Nui a Kiwa Weavers, then later the Māori Weavers formed Te Rōpūrāranga Whatu o Aotearoa, were instrumental in organising a series of weaving exhibitions from the 1986 onwards. The Hitit whānau, all cultural practitioners and teachers, spearheaded a Māori and Pacifica Museum and Arts training program in the late 1980s under a Māori arts community initiative called Te Whānau Paneke. They have taught and influenced many on their respective practitioner and cultural arts careers, including Kohai Grace, Megan Tamati Quinnell, Arapata Hakiwai, Shane Piscini, and Moana Davey. The museum and art gallery first trainee was Veronora Hitit, based at the Douse Art Gallery. I mihi to Veronora and her sister Lillian for developing the innovative online teaching program of which I am a tauira, the Hitit School of Māori Art. Veronora's teaching, based on a matrix of modules, continues the legacy of their mother, now reaches students across the world. Te Whānau Paneke was the closest example to the type of hands-on training that Ngata initiated for the School of Māori Arts that included carving and weaving tuition inspired by the taonga in the Dominion Museum 50 years earlier. The untimely passing of Eronora in 2006 is still keenly felt. Everything Eronora said and did was a learning, from passing on generations of weaving knowledge to making us think broadly about topics or issues from all angles. Eronora laid down the foundations of critical thinking while we sat in a circle weaving. Now I'm going to tell a story about Eronora and a beautiful kahukiwi, kiwi feather cloak, that she wove as a commission for Te Papa, and introduce an important cultural leader, Cliff Whiting, who was a renowned Māori contemporary artist, teacher, and advocate for Māori arts. He was also the first kaihotu Māori leader for Te Papa from 1995 to 1999. During the concept development phase for the new Te Papa building and Māori exhibitions around 1996, concerns were raised about the lack of Māori weaving in the new Māori exhibition plans. Cliff led the Māori exhibition developments. There was also very little contemporary weaving in the museum collection. We began to address this by having conversations with prominent senior weavers who had connections to the museum or were cultural heritage advisors in some capacity. Eronora agreed on the proviso that the cloak be worn rather than remain passive in the storeroom drawer and in a display case. She suggested that the cloak could be worn by visiting dignitaries as a symbol of manaakitanga or protection to honour the guest and to continue the life of the cloak as a symbol of mana. This was a startling proposal, as by this time, museum professionalism included conservation and collection management policies that did not include wearing or handling collection items outside of the exhibition process. Eronora pushed the boundaries of museum practice at that time, not because that was the purpose, but because it was the right thing to do, to honour the cloak and its weavers and its wearers according to tikanga. Eronora's kahukiwi was officially presented at the opening of Rongomarairoa, this marae, on 30th of November 1997. The kahukiwi was ceremonially placed over Cliff Whiting's shoulders, you can see in that image, by Lillian Hitit, the Hitit's eldest daughter. Since then, the cloak has been worn by visiting royalty, dignitaries, and iwi tohunga opening a whare wānanga complex, Māori staff member for her wedding, and a Māori staff member on her PhD graduation at Te Herenga Waka. This is Veronora with her mum's kaukiwi. There will come a time when this living taonga will need to be conserved, stabilised, or restored as the new elements introduced to continue to function as a symbol of mana. This is where the role of museums becomes interesting, because at the heart of the matter are power dynamics, as in who makes the decisions and why, and what is more important. Now to another story which involves the sweet sounds of taonga puoro, taonga hauora, Māori singing treasures generating well-being. How's everybody? You're feeling okay? Oh, cool. Okay. This is a Turnbull Library image, unknown photographer and unknown musician circa late 1940s. As I've explained, Māori art and practice steadily declined around the 19th century. For taonga puoro, the introduction of Christianity, European ways and legislation, such as the Tohunga Suppression Act 1907, to stop people using customary healing practices, buried the knowledge and performance of these taonga into the ground. In the middle of the 20th century, Te Rangi Hiro wrote, "The kōauau," which is a type of flute, "and its Stone Age comrades are forever mute." The perception was that taonga puoro was a past practice that had died with the ancestors who made and used them. Ancestral instruments lay silent in museum collections throughout the world. So much so that the term puoro passed into Māori understandings as a translation for European musical instruments like saxophones and trumpets. There were few known exponents by the 20th century. Those recorded by museum ethnologists were Henare Toka of Ngāti Whātua, Kui Pairoa Wenera of Ngāti Huia, Ngāti Tōrangatira, Te Aroa leader Joseph Malcolm, and Ngaitahu Karaua Māori Tirikātene raised in Whanganui. The resurgence of taonga puoro is now a distinctive part of Aotearoa, which gathered momentum from a special group of people led by the late Hirini Melbourne, the late Richard Nuns, and Brian Flintoff. Dr. Hirini Melbourne from Ngaituhoi was a much-loved composer, singer, academic, and teacher. His albums and publications have become classics, especially for early childhood Māori language learning programs. Hirini had a signature style of effortlessness, rhythms sung in his first language about elements of nature, which was in essence an immersion into the Māori world. Dr. Richard Nuns, tangata tiriti, was an accomplished jazz musician and teacher based in Nelson. Brian Flintoff, also tangata tiriti, is a well-respected bone and stone carver and former teacher based in Nelson. He is also the author of Taonga Puoro, Singing Treasures, published by Potton, an essential guide for learners of Taonga Puoro. Hirini named the group Haumanu, meaning breath of birds, a metaphor for the revival of Taonga Puoro. The Māori Artists and Writers Hui in Te Araroa in 1985 marked the start of a knowledge recovery journey. Hirini and Richard gathered the recollections of elders, mainly queer, from around the country, while Brian, as the practitioner, was focused on the production of new instruments. Workshops and wānanga took place on marae to play, learn and share knowledge with the local people. The many haumanu wānanga held around the country have been an important aspect of the regeneration of cultural knowledge and practice pertaining to taonga puoro. Wānanga have been held mainly on marae at the invitation of the local people. It was at these wānanga that the opportunity for new enthusiasts grew. Hirini, Richard and Brian took mentoring roles, but were joined by other skilled individuals, including Rangiiria Headley, Charles Royal, Bernard Makuare, Clem Mellish, Aroha Yates-Smith, Hene Wirangi Kohu Morgan, Horo Mona Horo, James Webster, Warren Warbrick, Rangi Kipa, Pōtaka Taite, Rangi O'Keefe, Robin Slow, Ariana Tikau, Jerome Kavanagh, Moana Maniapoto and James Rickard. Gosh, I didn't know there were so many names. In 1995, the Haumanu Group visited the National Museum in Wellington to discuss the gifting of a range of instruments that had been created at a wānanga at Otatara, Hawke's Bay in 1991. The Haumanu Group was interested in learning what the museum could do to support their vision and gifted instruments from the wānanga to the National Museum, on the proviso that they would be accessible for researchers. In these situations, perhaps the most challenging questions for museums are about cultural ownership and agency. An issue for taonga puoro practitioners is access to museum collections in order to enable both the art form and knowledge to survive. Richard reflected on this issue. It is his belief that museums are centred on Western theories with protocols based on the notion of physical protection, which lead to collections being exhibited behind glass, stored away and inaccessible. Taonga puoro practitioners bring to life the voices of the instruments of the past into the present. This idea of cultural continuity raises questions for museums due to the fact that people handling museum collections present conservation challenges. However, for practitioners, having direct access to taonga puoro is fundamental on all levels. As Richard noted, if the instruments are not held, greased and oiled, rebound, looked after, they lose their voice. Is it more preferable to have a taonga pristine, or is it more important that these taonga or musical instruments are still played? Now we have a new generation of haumanu called Haumanu Collective, and I'm very fortunate to be in this group. Our aims are to support the taonga puoro kaupapa or movement dedicated to the revival, teaching and sharing of taonga puoro. With the support of the Ministry of Culture and Heritage, Creative New Zealand, and now other agencies, Haumanu Collective is able to strengthen and grow. As kaitiaki o ngā taonga puoro, custodians of taonga puoro, and kaikaue o te Māori oro, carriers of the vitality, the Māori, or the frequencies, the vibrations, the oro, we create and support learning spaces that hold the depth and breadth of te reo, language, tikanga, what's right, and mātauranga knowledge of taonga puoro. Haumanu has had a long-standing relationship with Te Papa, from the exhibition cases in the Mana Whenua exhibition and the massive lineup of pūkaya players at the dawn opening 1998, to the formation of Haumanu ki Te Papa, staff enthusiasts gaining confidence to play puoro at ceremonial occasions, to the wānanga supported by Richard Nuns and the wider Haumanu group held at Te Papa and Hongoeka Marae, to the playing of taonga puoro collected on Cook's Voyages by Horomona Horo for the Michael Tuffrey First Contact performance in 2012 that Roma Potiki was involved with, to the gifting of bone instruments to staff by Brian Flintoff, where he wanted taonga puoro to have homes with people, not be stuck in a museum collection, to the Haumanu Collective celebrations we've had recently on Rongamarairo here, that Cliff would have approved of, including performances, panel talks, the launch of podcast series and an album. Oh, someone's phone. We appreciate the enduring relationship with Te Papa, but without structural commitment, without policy in place, without resourcing, people come and go, relationships wane, and inertia sets in. Richard Nuns once pointed out, museums are full of contradictions. They are laws unto themselves, depending on who is in charge at the time, much like Parliament. Oh, sorry. Why? Like George Horsecapture said, museums are strange and special places, one that Indigenous people have a love-hate relationship with. How can we change that? Should we change that? What should a museum be? Kaupapa Māori scholar Graham Smith says that it is not enough to transform institutions, rather, unequal power relations must be challenged. In 1993, Mina Mackenzie wrote an article titled A Challenge to Museums, Keeping the Taonga Warm. She argued that addressing the imbalance starts at board level. Museums should involve Māori elders and knowledge holders in developing policy and practice, and employ Māori people. In conclusion, she posed the question, do museums deserve life after Te Māori? 3 decades on from Mina Mackenzie's challenge and 4 decades from the Te Māori exhibition, the journey has moved along a spectrum of monoculturalism, biculturalism, to increasing Māori self-determination, according to Conor McCarthy. Oh, and David Butts. Mana taonga means the power and authority of taonga. The concept was introduced by Ngāti Porou leader Apirana Ngata with members of Ngā Kauawau, the Māori advisory group for Te Papa. Te Papa's board formally adopted the concept in 1992. Mana taonga became a corporate principle in 2003 and was understood as the idea of acknowledging the living relationship between taonga and their original communities. The concept was defined as the rights of iwi on the marae of Te Papa, with those rights conferred through the taonga in the museum collection. Spiritual and cultural ownership were guaranteed through whakapapa and cultural connections, including that of the creators. Keeping taonga warm and mana taonga are concepts that re-centre Māori connections in museum contexts. The idea of museums as whare wānanga, or places of learning, incorporates both the theory and methods associated with decolonisation, indigenisation. All of these concepts are underpinned by mana-enhancing principles, or ethics, that seek not only to rebalance, but also to uplift the well-being of everyone concerned. Now, another important concept from critical Indigenous theory is cultural pedagogy. This is something that, and I use my hands here, that generates knowledge, shapes values, and constructs identity. Pedagogy is the method and practice of teaching. Cultural pedagogy are ancestral Indigenous knowledge and teaching practices such as weaving, taonga puoro, carving, tāmoko, te reo me ona tikanga, that has the ability to heal and to express tino rangatiratanga, sovereignty, and mana motuhake, self-determination of that culture. To summarise, throughout time, cultural leaders working with communities have sustained cultural practice as Ngata wanted. The examples I've given are the revitalisation of taonga puoro that has moved from surviving to thriving. The phase we are in now is one of taonga puoro as taonga hauora, frequencies, abundance of healing that is reverberating through traditional health practices, Indigenous and world music connections, composition, making and playing, kapahaka, cultural performance, reclaiming and innovating knowledge and practice. The taonga puoro movement is beyond the four walls of any museum institution now and isn't reliant on access to museum collections in quite the same way that was needed 40 years ago. In te wharepora o Hinete Iwiwa, the discipline of Māori weaving, weavers have noticed and noted that taonga in museums lack life. They believe strongly that people working with taonga in museums should have lived experience, not learnt from a book, but have spent genuine time living amongst communities. Weavers have said that what is really lacking in museums is the restoration or renewal of the life of taonga. They also made the point that tikanga upholding Māori protocols and customs is paramount. What I know now as a result of my investigations is that museums can still be harmful while being benign and well-intentioned. Museums are problematic, hierarchical power knowledge structures with conflicting goals. This enables contrary behaviours, pursuing collaboration while resisting change, applying self-reflexivity without challenging the system. Museums are contested knowledge systems driven by the representation of objects as a means of reflecting on existence and universal ideals concerning the human condition. From a Māori practitioner's point of view, museums default to Western practice, conditioned by self-interest and state concerns. As museum studies historian Raymond Silverman says, museums have not yet learnt to fully embrace how to let go of some of the power and authority. The lack of cultural understanding and the overwhelming amount of displaced heritage that languishes in museums are evidence that something is not quite right. For overseas museums, the shortfalls are more palpable. Lack of resources, time, complacency, and indifference are serious problems. This is a Māori display at the Perth Museum in Scotland. It's a collaboration with Te Papa Mātauranga Māori curators, including Dougal Austin, Museum and Heritage Studies students, Ringatoi, Ngāti Ranana, Te Kenehi Teira and Kararaina Teira, which opened March last year in 2014. Okay. Taking this awareness further into postdoctoral research is an incredible opportunity to now look worldwide to open the scope of inquiry to our taonga that are in museums overseas, mindful that many taonga are in private collections, and to connect to our Indigenous relations who are on a similar reclamation pathway. Karanga taonga, karanga tangata, karanga whenua, searching for taonga puoro and karetao in overseas museums is a research kaupapa that aims to connect these ancestral forms of taonga to practitioners and descendant communities where known. Karetao have different tribal names: karetao, karari, tokorau rape, tokorau rupe, rapatahuri, repetahuri. We loathe to call them puppets. They are much more than that. They are taonga tuku iho. We have yet to settle on an appropriate term in English, but for now I'm calling them ancestral animated storytellers. It is said that taonga puoro and karetao were used to heal the people and the land. This research continues the call to focus on strategies that address the recovery and reclamation of taonga important to Māori well-being. The extent of taonga held by overseas museums is not clear. This research will address knowledge gaps, correct information, and encourage opportunities for practitioner and community engagement. The objectives are to locate, collate, work with museums, and share information based on kaupapa Māori principles and approaches. cultural practitioners, scholars, and researchers continue to access museum collections. This research aims to make accessible database images and information into an accessible central source as a puna mātauranga. Here I acknowledge the amazing practitioners that are reintroducing contemporary karetao through performance incorporating taonga puoro, healing practices, and knowledge of the maramataka Māori lunar calendar into our lives. Leading this area are James Thornton Webster, Hinamore Jones, Ricky Solomon, Whetu and Kormaku Silva, Libby Gray, and Horomona Horo. There is a growing movement alongside taonga puoro players, makers, rongoa practitioners, artists, and researchers. Carvers and taonga puoro practitioners such as Tamihana Kātene and Joel Komene no doubt will also bring their skills to the space. Alongside this has been the privilege of working with Professor Brian Onsio from the University of Exeter, UK, the Eversons, Chief Wedledi Speck, and members of the Kumugwai Cultural Society based at Comox, Vancouver Island, British Columbia, Canada, on a research project called The Future of Indigenous Rights and Responsibilities, Ancestral Governance, Environmental Stewardship, Language Revival, and Cultural Vibrancy, funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council, UK. A component of the project undertaken by Chief Andy Everson and his nephew Carver Everson, both prominent artists and cultural practitioners, was to visit museum collections to recreate ancestral pieces and reintroduce back into cultural practice. This is exactly the type of cultural reclamation and restoration of heritage in museums that we're concerned with today. Relationships are important. Hongoeka Marae hosted the Kumugwai Cultural Group in February this year, and we look forward to future opportunities to continue to support each other's communities. We held a Toi Arts Day at Hongoeka Marae while our Kumugwai whānau were with us, which was absolutely fantastic. We have a lot of talented Ngāti Tōringa Toi artists, weavers, carvers, tāmogo artists. It was just great. In conclusion, taking Graham Smith's point that it is not enough to transform institutions, rather unequal power relations must be challenged, then I suggest this idea, that constitutional reform in museums involves cultural restoration or active practice as a decolonising process. Anthropologist Christina Krebs wrote this: "The liberation of culture is not only about giving back or restoring a people's right to and control over the management of their cultural heritage, it is also about liberating thinking from the Eurocentric view of what constitutes a museum, artefact, and museological practice, so that we might better recognise alternative forms. It is vital that there is a change in the culture of museums to make shifts of power within its own structure and transform how it understands its role in society. Building relationships is key." Some slides here of a research project that we undertook with Auckland Museum involving Dante Bonica, who is mātanga in Te Ao Kohatu, with Justine Trubel from Auckland Museum, and whānau weavers from Raukawa, whānau from Hongoeka. What we were doing was relearning how to weave a very complicated 3-ply plait that are often seen on ancestral bindings for taonga puoro. Oh. Shall I carry on? Okay. Cultural reclamation is a rejuvenation of the flow of mātauranga Māori. This flow can be described as mauri, a life force or vital energy, as taonga Māori scholar Jamie Metzger says. Māori practitioners hold the mauri of their taonga, through which Māori knowledge is applied and passed down as a teaching framework, as taonga tukuiho treasures handed down, as indigenous pedagogies or cultural practices. Museums must acknowledge the authority and self-determination of all cultural practitioners over their material culture and representation in museums if they are to be respectful partners under Te Tiriti o Waitangi and thereby to open themselves up to new possibilities. Finally, this quote from Te Ariki Nui Kuini ngā wai hono I te pō. Tino rangatira tangatia tōreo, mana motu haketea te taiao, tino rangatira tangatia tō hauora, mana motu haketea tō pāharakeke. Let your language be sovereign, our environment be independent, your health be sovereign, and our families be independent. Tēnā koutou katoa.
Kia ora no tātou. Kāne ngā mihi ki a koe a whena, hei whakarotanga mā tātou, I tēnei wā. So we have time for some questions and discussion, and I'll take the privilege as chair to ask the first question, which is, you've discussed this tension between preservation and the ongoing revitalisation of cultural practices, and you finished with a quote there from Christina Krebs about liberating culture and about new ideas about what a museum could be, or what collections, exhibitions and so on could be. So looking forward, looking in your crystal ball, what can you tell us what you see at this stage as a result of your research, your teaching, your curatorial practice, what you think a Māori museology or Indigenous museology might look like, and how would it be different to conventional Western models?
Okay. Can you hear me? Oh, great. I think it's already happening. And I remember a lecture that Connell gave, Connell's inaugural lecture at Victoria University. And Connell described Lisa Osborne, is Lisa here? Māori collection manager, and her practice, and how Lisa goes into the Māori storeroom early in the morning, and Lisa has karakia. And that's tikanga Māori in practice. So it's already definitely happening. And I've just described the reclamation of knowledge through te wharepora o hene te iwi wa weaving discipline and taonga puoro, haumanu kaupapa. So definitely cultural practitioners are already engaging and moving beyond the four walls, as I said, of a museum, and introducing cultural practice as living forms of knowledge. Museums, I believe, can help assist that movement by also decolonising themselves, re-indigenising their practice by supporting that. Yeah, so I believe it's already happening, but needs to happen more, I think. And I would like to open up to the floor if anyone has any other kōrero to add to that conversation.
Kia ora. So we have a roving mic. So any pātai or kōrero, any questions or discussion from anyone in our audience here? Kei a koutou te wā.
Particularly from an iwi point of view, perhaps. No. No one.
Or maybe just to prime the pump a little bit, just moving on from what you were just saying, Awhina, what would your advice be to professionals working in museums and galleries and other collection organisations, kaitaki Māori, non-Māori, and what would be your advice to communities in terms of realising this future vision?
Okay. So I mentioned in my talk, one of the weavers had mentioned that it would be good if people who look after taonga museums actually lived amongst communities for a period of time, rather than just maybe come from overseas and having learnt in a university or read in books about Māori culture and Māori and tikanga Māori. So I think that if you are training in the museum sector and you want to understand Māori culture, you have to live amongst the people. You have to work alongside them and get to know people to really understand how to look after taonga Māori. Looking after taonga is about looking after people and communities as well. So things aren't separate, they're very much related and connected.
And your advice to communities?
Okay, I can't really say. Every community is different, and I believe it's up to each and every community to say what their mana motuhaketanga and how they want to see their futures. So, I also think that it's good to maybe broaden thinking by, and I'm speaking to Māori who would like to go to places like Museum and Heritage Studies and extend their knowledge in terms of the museum and the GLAM sector, galleries, libraries, archive sector, just so that you know exactly what you're dealing with in this area.
Kia ora. Roma's got a question here. Can we have a microphone over here, please? Just there. Yep.
Sorry, Connell.
Kia ora koutou. I just wondered, Awhina, in the past, it's quite a distant past, a few decades ago, some Māori were assisted to work in museums. There was a scheme, it wasn't that large, but there was some assistance. A degree takes money, determination, and opportunity, So do you have any thoughts on how museums, apart from the community coming in, or the marae, or particular hapu, the museum tends to be, and I've worked in museums and galleries for quite a while now, it can become slightly hermetic and it's closed off and it's got its own power structure, whether it realises it or owns up to it or not, And so Māori admittance is often within quite a defined framework, that the institution to some degree chooses, though Māori, come in on the cultural side, the kawa side, so on. So we know that imbalance is there structurally and in the power relationships at the top levels. And are there ways that museums, that you can see them actually making entree for certain Māori people? They might be picked from within a hapu or an iwi, could come in, they could get the qualification as well, but, that they're allowed in anyway. That the museum makes entree for people and is listening to elders across a range and makes genuine inroads to try and change its own internal culture and practices. I wonder, you have thought about this possibly quite a lot more than I have, what you see in that area.
Yeah, okay. I don't have a crystal ball. I'm aware of all these issues, and I think that it's good to just start having conversations about the different strategies to make things happen. And I do know that Te Papa does a really good job in enabling and succession planning for Māori to enter into the different types of roles and jobs that are here. So I think Te Papa is a really good role model. So maybe someone from Te Papa might want to comment too on what you're saying. Auckland Museum also been doing a fantastic job, really focused on community projects and having the community decide on what it is that they would like. So I think around the country there are different things going on that are really interesting, just to try and break down, I guess, this hierarchical structure that we have inherited.
Thanks for that question, Roma. Any other questions or comments out there? Yes, Fenella.
Ngā mihi nui, Awhina, fantastic. I'm curious about I feel that terminology in the description of taonga is really important, and when that's been imposed from a Western perspective, it drains life from the taonga. And do you have any thoughts and suggestions about how that can help regenerate the access to materials, because so many collection items are not accessible because they haven't actually been catalogued in an appropriate way and in the appropriate language?
Was that a question about just language or about how to make taonga come to life in collections?
Kind of two. One was about bringing it to life, but also the fact that so much of the descriptor is not in Māori. Does that make sense?
Okay, yeah. I think it goes back really to having more Māori people working and looking after taonga in museums to be able to enable those sorts of things to really come to life. So it's multi-dimensional, but it would be up to whānau hapua niwi who relate to the taonga or practitioners to be able to, I guess, think about ways in which they can best connect to those taonga. Which means that the museum should really work on their relationships with communities of practitioners.
Thanks, Fenella. Time for one more question. Yes, right at the back over here. Thank you.
Oh, kia ora. Thank you for that awesome talk. Kia ora, Awhina. I just trying to work this out. I'm reminded of an American comedian who said he went to the British Museum and never saw a single British thing in it. The museum honours the colonial and imperial history of the British Empire rather than the people that it represents, and it seems to give more credence to the collectors, which the comedian quipped was reminded him of the great story Abi Baba and the 40 collectors, that this is about plunder. But I think here in Aotearoa, museums have a slightly different role because they can connect people to who they are and their culture. And I'm reminded a personal story of when I attended Te Māori as a much younger person in a much more probably spiritually confused way, and found it an incredibly healing and powerful experience. And then about 20 years ago, my children came to the Ngaitahu exhibition here, which had the same impact on them. And I remember their tears as they worked through who they were through the expression of these taonga. So I think that's a powerful part that museums can do in terms of, particularly here in Aotearoa, what they can bring to the to Māori who have not necessarily grown up in the area where they come from. So it can be a way of forging connections. Kia ora.
Thank you. Perfect way to end.
Well, no. Ka muti ko nā tātou kōrero mō tēnei wā. I'd like to thank everybody for coming along tonight, and those of you online for joining in. Thanks to Te Papa for hosting the Vulcan Lecture for another year. And please, everybody, join me in thanking Awhina for her lecture tonight. Now everybody, refreshments await. So if you follow Victoria and her team, they will take you to the other side of the building for a glass of wine with your name on it. Kia ora tātou.